Washington, D.C., February 10, 1966. 10:03 a.m. The hearing room in the United States Senate is packed. Senators, staffers, journalists, photographers, all of them crowded into a space designed for legislative procedure, not spectacle. But today there is a spectacle. Today, the most powerful corporation in the world is going to answer questions from a 31-year-old lawyer from Connecticut who has never run a company, never built a car, never managed anything larger than a small legal practice. General Motors, the largest corporation in America, the company that built one of every 2 cars sold in the United States, the company whose annual revenue exceeded the gross domestic product of most nations on Earth, has sent its president, James Roche, to testify before the Senate. He is not here because GM wants to be here. He is here because Ralph Nader put him here. And what James Roche is about to say, what he is about to admit in front of the television cameras in the Senate and the American public, will change the automobile industry, the legal system, and the relationship between corporations and citizens so completely that nothing will ever be the same again. He will admit that General Motors hired private detectives to investigate Ralph Nader, to tap his phones, to follow him, to interview his friends and colleagues and neighbors, to look for evidence of communist sympathies, sexual impropriety, or mental instability that could be used to discredit him. Because Ralph Nader had written a book. And the book had told the truth about American cars. And General Motors had decided that the truth was more dangerous than anything they had ever built. Ralph Nader was born in 1934 in Winsted, Connecticut, the son of Lebanese immigrants who ran a restaurant and believed, with a fervor that they passed directly to their son, that American democracy was the most extraordinary political invention in human history, and that it only worked if citizens were willing to fight for it. He graduated from Princeton and then from Harvard Law School, where he was editor of the Law Review and known among his classmates as someone who read everything, remembered everything, and was willing to argue about anything with a persistence that was either inspiring or exhausting, depending on your tolerance for being wrong. He drove a used car. He wore the same suits for years. He lived in a rooming house in Washington that cost $14 a week. He had no television, no credit cards, no car of his own. His personal expenses were so minimal that he was able to live on the advance from his book for years. This was not poverty. This was philosophy. Ralph Nader had decided, with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything, that the most effective way to fight powerful institutions was to be completely independent of them, to have no financial interests that could be pressured, no lifestyle that could be threatened, no comfort that could be taken away. He was, in the most literal sense, incorruptible. And in a world where corporations had learned to manage critics through a combination of financial inducement and social pressure, incorruptibility was the most dangerous quality imaginable. The book was called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was published in November 1965. It was not a bestseller in the conventional sense. It was dense, technical, heavily footnoted, written in the language of legal briefs rather than popular journalism. It was not the kind of book that people read on airplanes or recommended to friends at dinner parties, but it contained something that no amount of dry prose could obscure. It contained the truth about the Chevrolet Corvair. The Corvair was General Motors' answer to the European compact cars that were beginning to appear in American showrooms in the late 1950s. It was innovative in a genuinely interesting way, a rear-engine design that gave it handling characteristics different from conventional American cars, with an air-cooled engine that eliminated the heavy radiator and cooling system of traditional designs. It was also, according to Ralph Nader's meticulous research, dangerous. The rear-engine design created handling characteristics that were poorly understood by American drivers accustomed to conventional front-engine cars. Under certain conditions, particularly in sharp turns or sudden evasive maneuvers, the Corvair had a tendency toward oversteer that could cause the car to spin out of control in ways that drivers had no warning of and no training to manage. General Motors engineers knew this. Internal documents, Documents that Nader had obtained through sources within the industry and through the legal discovery process in accident lawsuits showed clearly that GM's own testing had identified the handling problem. The company had developed a simple, inexpensive fix, a front anti-roll bar that would have cost approximately $15 per car and would have substantially reduced the handling problem. GM had decided not to install it. The decision was not made by evil men. It was made by accountants and executives applying the standard cost-benefit analysis that corporations use for every product decision. The cost of the fix multiplied by the number of cars produced was significant. The cost of potential lawsuits, which would only materialize if accidents occurred and if lawyers could prove defective design, was uncertain and potentially manageable. The $15 was saved. The anti-roll bar was not installed, and people died. Nader documented the deaths. He documented the accidents. He documented the internal memos and the engineering reports and the legal settlements paid to families of victims. He documented, in the precise and unsparing language of a lawyer presenting evidence, the complete picture of a corporation that had known its product was dangerous and had chosen profit over safety. General Motors' response to unsafe at any speed was the response of an institution that had never been seriously challenged and did not know how to behave when it was. They hired private investigators. The investigation was managed through a law firm that provided deniability. GM could claim they had simply retained lawyers who had, in the course of legal due diligence, gathered information. The investigators were instructed to find anything that could be used to discredit Nader personally. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. Ralph Nader's finances were impeccable. His personal life was entirely conventional. His political views were those of a mainstream American liberal. His mental health was obviously sound. His professional credentials were beyond reproach. The investigators, having found nothing useful, resorted to tactics that went beyond conventional investigation. They interviewed Nader's friends and asked questions designed to suggest he might be homosexual, which in 1965 was considered sufficient to destroy a professional reputation. They approached women he had dated with questions about his private behavior. They made phone calls to his contacts that were clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. And then they made a mistake. They tried to have a woman approach Nader in a supermarket and engage him in conversation designed to lead to a compromising situation. Nader noticed, and Nader, who had spent his professional life learning how institutions behaved when they felt threatened, understood immediately what was happening. He reported the surveillance to the Senate subcommittee that was already investigating automobile safety. He hired a lawyer. He prepared for the confrontation that GM, through its own actions, had made inevitable. February 10, 1966. The Senate hearing room. James Roche, the president of General Motors, sat before the Senate subcommittee and admitted that GM had authorized the investigation of Ralph Nader. The admission was extraordinary. The president of the largest corporation in America was confessing, on national television, that his company had attempted to spy on, intimidate, and discredit a private citizen whose crime was writing a book that told the truth. Senator Abraham Ribicoff, who was chairing the hearing, looked at Roche and said something that the American public would remember. "You're a great corporation, but you have acted as a private eye, and I think that is beneath the dignity of General Motors." The room was silent. Roche apologized. He said the investigation had been a mistake. He said he personally regretted it. He said General Motors had no intention of interfering with the democratic process or the rights of any individual citizen. It was too late. The image of the most powerful corporation in America, caught spying on a 31-year-old lawyer with a used car and a $14 a week room, was too perfect and too complete to be managed by any apology. Ralph Nader sued General Motors for invasion of privacy. GM settled for $425,000, the largest privacy settlement in American legal history at that time. Nader used every dollar of it to fund consumer advocacy organizations that would continue fighting General Motors and every other corporation that put profit before safety for the next 50 years. The legislative consequences were swift and permanent. In September 1966, 7 months after James Roach's testimony, President Lyndon Johnson signed the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act into law. For the first time in American history, the federal government had the authority to establish mandatory safety standards for automobiles. For the first time, car manufacturers could be required, not requested, not encouraged, but required, to install safety features that engineers had known for years could save lives. The first standards required seat belts in all new cars, then padded dashboards, then safety glass, then head restraints, then energy-absorbing steering columns that would collapse in a crash rather than impaling the driver. Then, over the following decades, airbags, anti-lock brakes, electronic stability control, backup cameras, a continuous expansion of mandatory safety technology that has, by the most conservative estimates, saved more than 3 million American lives since 1966. 3 million people are alive today because Ralph Nader wrote a book and General Motors tried to destroy him for it. Every car built since 1966, every car built anywhere in the world for any market, has been designed in the shadow of the standards that Ralph Nader forced into existence. The engineers at Toyota and BMW and Mercedes and Volkswagen and every other manufacturer work within a framework of safety requirements that would not exist if a 31-year-old lawyer from Connecticut had not decided that the truth about the Chevrolet Corvair was worth telling. The Corvair itself did not survive the controversy. GM continued producing it through 1969, but sales collapsed after unsafe at any speed. The car that had been innovative and interesting became the car that had killed people while GM looked the other way, and no amount of engineering improvement could change what the name now meant to the American public. The last Corvair rolled off the assembly line on May 14, 1969. General Motors never built another rear-engine passenger car. Ralph Nader continued working. He founded the Public Interest Research Group. He established the Center for Auto Safety. He advocated for consumer protection legislation in banking, food safety, environmental regulation, and a dozen other areas where corporations had been operating without adequate accountability to the public they served. He ran for President of the United States 5 times, as an independent candidate, winning enough votes in 2000 to become one of the most controversial figures in American electoral history. Blamed by many Democrats for taking votes from Al Gore in Florida, credited by others with forcing consumer issues into the national political conversation. He is, at 90 years old, still working. He still lives simply. He still drives a used car. He still wears the same suits for years. He has never taken a corporate salary, never accepted a corporate board position, never allowed his financial independence to be compromised by the institutions he spent his life holding accountable. In the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration offices in Washington, there's a calculation that safety engineers use when evaluating the impact of regulatory requirements. It is called the value of a statistical life, an estimate of what American society is willing to spend to prevent one death through regulatory intervention. The number is currently approximately $11 million. Multiply that by 3 million lives saved since 1966. That is the value of Ralph Nader's book. That is the value of one lawyer, one used car, a $14 a week room, and the decision that the truth about American automobiles was worth whatever General Motors was willing to do to silence it. The spirit of ecstasy rises above the Rolls-Royce. The prancing horse gallops on the Ferrari. The roundel turns on the BMW. And on every one of them, on every car built anywhere in the world since 1966, invisible and unacknowledged but absolutely present, is the fingerprint of a 31-year-old lawyer from Connecticut who decided that enough was enough. His name is Ralph Nader, and he changed every car on Earth.